The Legendarium of J.R.R. Tolkien is often recognized by fans and scholars as a linguistic playground where Tolkien, a career philologist, could not just invent languages, but use them within the context of an imagined world with its own history, watching how they unfold and change over time. Less acknowledged, but no less present, is how Tolkien's Legendarium functions as historiography. Tolkien was very intentional in his pseudo-historical constructions, inventing narrators and alluding to layers of oral and textual traditions underneath whatever text you might be reading at the time. At multiple points in his letters, he spoke of the artistic appeal of such an approach, describing the appeal of unattainable vistas, available only as a glimpse on a mist-shrouded horizon. As a literary technique, these unattainable vistas function similarly to the edges of a map or the margins of a page, inviting us to imagine what we cannot see, but know must lie beyond what has been made available to us. New discoveries, in turn, open new vistas, creating a world that can never be fully known. In some instances, the historiographical features of the text of the Legendarium are blatant and easily detected. In some of the texts that form the published Silmarillion, published in the History of Middle-earth, Tolkien includes elaborate preambles that identify not just the narrator, but the process of transmission. In most cases, though, and especially in the published Silmarillion, Tolkien's historiographical devices are far subtler, a fact produced partly by Christopher Tolkien's editorial decision to remove all attributions to the narrators. As I've researched the narrators of the Silmarillion over the better part of a decade now, I frequently encounter scholars who assert that the Silmarillion is written from an omniscient point of view. This is not only false, but a misunderstanding with important consequences. If Arda is a land of unattainable vistas, an omniscient narrator plops a painted backdrop into the middle of a living, boundless landscape, instead of allowing for the possibility that every person we encounter hastens off to his or her own story with his or her own vistas. What we see simply is, with no allowance for other points of view. There is no assembling of glimpses through the mist, no imagining the unseen, at least in terms of point of view. This is true of the cultures of Arda as well. What the Silmarillion tells us simply is? Dwarves are stoic, Ovari are wild, Orcs are evil. But if the narrator of the Silmarillion is not omniscient, that calculus changes. None of those things have to be true, and there are as many Silmarillions as there are people within it. Furthermore, if we can identify the narrator or narrators of the Silmarillion, we can analyze and even challenge some of those assumptions. As a history teacher myself, I urge my students to consider how we know what we know about the past and who is telling the story. If we apply similar ways of reading to the Legendarium, we discover that the gaps in fabrications tend to fall where we'd expect them to, based on the narrator telling the story. It is subtle, but marks Tolkien's brilliance not just as a philologist, but as a historiographer. Today, I want to apply this approach to reading the Silmarillion as history to the concept of the other. By definition, the other is different from the dominant group in key noticeable ways. The other doesn't have to be an outsider or a minority, but can be. In many cases, the other is viewed as inferior, even subhuman. So who is the other in the Silmarillion? First, we must identify the point of view from which the Silmarillion is told, the narrator. As the historian E.H. Carr observed in a 1961 lecture given at the University of Cambridge, when we take up a work of history, our first concern should be not with the facts which it contains, but with the historian who wrote it. That person within the Legendarium who wrote the Silmarillion defines who we, as readers, come to see as the other. For today's purposes, I am going to focus only on the Quenta Silmarillion, the third and longest book of the published text, which contains the history of the First Age. So who wrote the Quenta Silmarillion? Thanks to Christopher Tolkien's effort to publish much of the material that informed the published Silmarillion, we are able to answer that question with a fair degree of confidence. By the early 1930s, the first texts emerged that, when held next to the published volume, are easily recognizable as Silmarillion texts. Some of these texts were written as historical annals. The first set of these attribute a narrator called Pengalath the Wise, identifying him as an elf of Gondolin who, after its fall, ended up at Sirian's Haven and later returned west to Tol Eressëa. 30 years later, Tolkien would expand Pengalath's biography in a text called Quendi and Eldar, to add that he was of mixed Sindar and Noldor ancestry and spent part of the Second Age in Khazad-dûm. In those 30 years, Tolkien's vision of how the history of the First Age and earlier eventually arrived in Bilbo's hands in Rivendell took shape. Rumil, the same Noldo who invented writing, penned the almond materials, which Pengalath took up, adding to it the history of Beleriand. The exception to this was the material about Turin Turambar. This material was authored by Dirival of the Havens, a mortal poet who collected material from disparate sources at the Havens, authoring from it the Children of Hurin. Note, however, that Pengalath and Dirival's paths collide at the Havens of Sirion, where the traditions of the three narrators experience an overlap. The common denominator of all three, the character who both survived and ventured forth to carry what he learned beyond the First Age, is Pengalath. The map, which is not geographically precise, as it attempts to meld the geographies of three ages into one, shows the three narrators. Rumil and Dirival stay put, but Pengalath encounters their work and carries it far and wide. From this central hub at the Havens at Sirion, Pengalath also encounters Elros, whose founding of Numenor brings his people into contact with the elves of Tol Eressëa, which will eventually include Pengalath, and Elrond, who establishes Imladris. Imladris has a famed library, and the Númenóreans who escape their island's inundation will come to found Minas Tirith with its own library. From these sources come the Hobbit's Red Book of Westmarch, and so Pengalath's thread is present throughout the transmission of the histories of the First Age. The other, then, from the point of view of Pengalath, includes not just groups outside the Noldor and the Sindar, but even members of those groups who would have been unfamiliar to a narrator who lived most of his life hemmed inside the isolationist realm of Gondolin. Pengalath's ignorances and biases as a narrator manifest in many forms across the Silmarillion, again illustrating the subtle touch with which Tolkien presented his legendarium as historiography. One area where Pengalath's point of view reveals itself is in how he presents death, grief, and mourning in the Quenta Silmarillion. If you've read the Quenta Silmarillion, you know that it is a fruitful orchard of death. In just over 100,000 words, 88 named characters die 90 deaths. Beren and Luthien each die twice, in addition to the uncountable thousands of unnamed characters who perish in its pages. Back in April 2024, I presented at the Tolkien at UVM conference about historical bias, death, and grief in the Quenta Silmarillion, observing that for all the death it contains, the Quenta Silmarillion is rather short on grief and mourning. Only 27% of named characters were grieved, and only 19% received some kind of mourning ritual, a funeral, monument, or memorial song. That makes these noteworthy events, and looking closer at who is grieved and mourned shows that almost all characters who would have been favored by a narrator with Pengalath's background. Grief and mourning, in other words, serve as a shorthand in the Silmarillion for Pengalath's regard for certain characters. We can use death scenes, therefore, to analyze how Tolkien presented the other through the point of view of Pengalath. Dwarves occupy an unusual status as the other from Pengalath's point of view. We know from the elf-centric histories of the Silmarillion that elves and dwarves are often depicted at odds with each other. While they sometimes formed productive trade relations and military alliances, those allegiances are rarely depicted as warm. The Silmarillion describes the dwarves as extremely skilled but difficult to get along with, and tempted by greed. From this, we'd assume an elf of mixed Noldor and Sindarin ancestry like Pengalath, who lived in Gondolin, a realm betrayed by Maeglin, one of the few elves to form a warm relationship with the dwarves, would not be inclined to humanize the dwarves by accompanying their death scenes with grief and mourning, evidence that they were loved and missed by others around them after their deaths. Recall, however, that Quendai and Eldar adds the important fact that Pengalath spent time in Khazad-dûm in the Second Age. After the inundation of Beleriand, Tolkien describes the rise of the Noldoran realm of Eregion, in collaboration with Khazad-dûm, as a time where friendship arose between dwarves and elves such as never elsewhere been, to the enrichment of both those peoples. Presumably, Pengalath was part of this allegiance and reaped the benefit of thawed relations between elves and dwarves to access dwarven histories and perspectives. There are only 6 named dwarves in the Quenta Silmarillion, and 3 of them die, in addition to countless unnamed dwarves, most of whom perish in the strife between the dwarven city of Nogrod and Thingol's elven realm of Doriath. These are some of the most poignant scenes of grief in the Quenta Silmarillion. As noted earlier, expressions of grief, and especially memorial rituals, are rare in the Quenta Silmarillion. 2 of the 3 named dwarves who die receive both grief and some form of memorial action, and grief is a part, indeed a motive, for the attack on Doriath by the dwarves of Nogrod. Osgol, the lord of Belagost, dies in driving the dragon Glaurung from the field during the Battle of Unnumbered Tears, at which point The dwarves raised up the body of Azaghal and bore it away, and with slow steps they walked behind, singing a dirge in deep voices, as it were a funeral pomp in their country, and gave no heed more to their foes, and none dared stay them. This moment is one of the most memorable in Pengalath's telling of the Battle of Unnumbered Tears. Azaghal and the dwarves are described as possessing great dignity, and the power of their loss is suggested to be so powerful that they withhold the war around them long enough to exit the field. At the same time, there is an otherness to this scene. Pengalath is careful to note that it is like a funeral pomp in their country, marking them as outsiders and foreigners. The strangeness of the ritual is alluded to as at least part of the reason for its success in removing the dwarves from battle. That none dared stay them suggests that the friends and foes alike around them were intimidated by the bold stoicism of the dwarves in this scene, and this reinforces the stereotype of the dwarves as stubborn and hardy beyond other groups. Other death scenes involving dwarves involve more typical displays of grief. But again, they involve grief, and in a text almost devoid of this most human of expressions, that is notable. When Mim finds his son Kim slayed by an arrow shot by one of Turin's band of outlaws, he tore his beard and wailed, crying one name unceasingly. His grief is so profound that he not only earns an apology from Turin, but the only example of weregild in the Quenta Silmarillion. When the dwarves who set the Silmaril in the Nalglamir are slain on their way home, the grief of those in Nogrod is described in similar terms of wailing and tearing at beards. There is, in short, no doubt that the dwarves feel powerful loss. They are other, but they are humanized through their grief. This is important, given how grief and mourning are wielded by Pengalath in other instances. Characters who Pengalath would have viewed negatively, Feanor and his sons, Eol and Maiglin, are given death scenes where grief, mourning, and any emotion associated with loss is conspicuously absent, creating an emotional vacuum around them that suggests their deeds leave them unworthy of love. Dwarven characters receive the opposite treatment. Pengalath seems to take pains to show dwarven death alongside emotion. Even Mim, who was the last of his kind, did not have anyone left to grieve him, shows fear and begs for mercy when facing his death. This scene parallels the creation of the dwarves, where Aule also intends to slay them but is moved to pity by their fear and obvious humanity. In contrast, Hurin's decision to kill Mim, despite his pleas, does not come across as entirely just. When showing the battle between Nogrod and Doriath, Pengalath shows both sides sympathetically, perhaps a nod to the fact that he had sources among both the dwarves and the Doriathrim. He does not do this with other elven characters and groups, the Feanorians chief among them, who also attacked Doriath over a Silmaril, making this sympathy noteworthy. It suggests that time in the company of the other humanizes them for Pengalath and shapes how he writes history involving them. Another group positioned as the other throughout the Silmarillion receives more mixed treatment, the Moriquendi, or Elves of the Darkness. Tolkien had a lot of terms for the varying groups of elves, and these are difficult to untangle. The Avari, who refused the journey to Aman, are distinct from the Umanyar, who began the journey but failed to complete it for any number of reasons. Distinct within the Umanyar are the Sindar, or Grey Elves, so named because they never intended to abandon the journey and are seen as occupying a, pardon the pun, gray area between the light of Aman and the darkness of Middle-earth. All are classified as Moriquendi, a term that seems to suggest inferiority to at least some of the Noldor, given that it is used by them pejoratively. The Moriquendi, save the Sindar, appear to occupy a gap in Pengalath's knowledge, and he says very little about them. Only 2 named non-Sindarin Moriquendi die in the published text, and the difference in how these scenes are presented illustrate another important point in how Tolkien, through the point of view of mostly Pengalath, presents the other. The first death scene involves Denethor, the king of the Green Elves of Osirion. Denethor receives the rare provision of grief from his people, but he died supporting the Sindar militarily, and their king, Thingol, is shown in a heroic light in this scene as he bitterly avenges Denethor's death. This makes Denethor not just heroic in his own people's histories, but in Sindarin history as well, and likely accounts for the attention Pengalath pays him here. Eol is technically a Sinda, but through his rejection of Doriath and his title Dark Elf, is more closely aligned with the non-Sindarin Moriquendi. Eol is the father of Maiglin, whose betrayal would later lead to the fall of Gondolin, Pengalath's home. Eol's death scene illustrates the profound lack of sympathy Pengalath has for him. Unlike the death scenes of the dwarves and Denethor, there is no grief or sorrow, or any emotion at all, beyond Eol's apparent anger at his son Maiglin. Maeglin himself is emotionally barren, experiencing neither sadness nor grief nor anger as he becomes an orphan at the hands of the state. Note the language. Eol literally ends, according to Pengaloth, a term that denies Eol's humanity so far that he is not even acknowledged as a living being, much less a human, who has just died. The dwarves Denethor and Eol reveal an important tendency in Pengaloth when writing the other. His own biases and experiences deeply influence how these characters are written, and grief and mourning are one way in which he extends humanity to some characters or groups over others. Finally, there is the ultimate other in the Silmarillion, the Orcs, or the other servants of Melkor, who are depicted as unilaterally opposed to, well, everyone else. There is no "the enemy of my enemy is my friend" at play here. Pengaloth detests the Feanorians and Eol, and they all detest the servants of Melkor. Pengaloth uses death scenes involving the enemy to deprive them of humanity, so that we understand that their deaths in the war are an indisputable good. First, aside from a few high-ranking enemies who put up a considerable fight, none of the enemy characters are named. The closest an orc in the Quenta Silmarillion comes to being depicted as an individual is the nameless orc captain who brags about killing Barahir and is subsequently slain by Beren. Otherwise, orcs exist in nameless, faceless hordes, less like individual people and more like herds or swarms of animals, where the will of any individual is entirely subsumed by the intention of the group. Naturally, there is no acknowledgement of grief or mourning among the servants of Melkor in the Quenta Silmarillion. There is no orc father sobbing over the body of his fallen son. There are no orc people who change their system of governance to memorialize a fallen leader. There is not even a mention of a revenge motive. Instead, scenes of orc death show them as too overwhelmed by fear to act in anyone's interest but their own, becoming so terrified that they become a hysterical hive mind that is easily slain as a single unit. Apparently, in Pengaloth's view, they lack the kinds of emotional bonds that inspire revenge. Tolkien, writing from Pengaloth's point of view, chooses language and death scenes involving the enemy, especially orcs, that negates any humanity the reader might assume they possess. The first is the use of the word drive. In the Quenta Silmarillion, Tolkien uses several meanings of the word drive, and it often appears in death scenes, especially involving large numbers of unnamed orcs. The word drive, as used in those scenes, is a word that removes the agency of its object. A person driven by another lacks autonomy and control. Furthermore, this usage brings to mind connotations to do with animals, such as driving cattle or other herds of tractable, witless beasts, or enslavement, as in a slave driver. Enslavement is a conditioning requiring dehumanization, a person reduced to a beast or to chattel. In scenes involving orcs or other enemies, they are often driven to their deaths, again evoking a brutish mob incapable of individual action or resistance. This also positions the driver as superior to the driven, a person effortlessly shepherding a horde of enemies unto death. Note also that these scenes often involve the enemy being driven into an environment that is hostile to life, such as a desert or a river. This negates even the drama of battle, implied in other scenes where characters aligned with the forces of good are driven forth from their homes, and simply sends these orcs en masse in a terrified clamor before a superior foe to be quietly gulped up by the landscape. These death scenes also contain metaphors that compare orcs to vegetation. Twice, orcs are referred to as leaves, and once they are compared to straw in a great fire. Again, these metaphors are dehumanizing and reinforce the ideas of orcs as lacking individuality and existing only as parts of a larger entity. Consider the metaphor of the leaves used twice. Leaves from the same tree are indistinguishable from each other. They exist to provide, to serve, if you will, the larger organism from which they grow. They cannot survive independently. It is furthermore part of the life cycle of all leaves to perish, even if the plant from which they grow continues to survive. Barring disease or distress, the loss of leaves is not generally tragic for a tree, nor are we given to understand it is the loss of orcs a matter of sorrow or grief. This makes the leaf metaphors used to describe orcs notable, especially given the trees generally represent positive concepts in the legendarium. Here they represent something living, yes, but subsidiary to a larger organism, lacking individuality, unable to survive without it, and ultimately expendable. The fallen leaves and burning straw of these metaphors of orc death again melt into the landscape without fanfare, leaving nothing behind worth grieving or memorializing. Historically, in the primary world, propaganda often reduces the enemy similarly to a horde composed not of individuals, but of physically indistinguishable parts subservient to a larger and sinister cause. These hordes are described as going uncomplainingly to death so long as it serves the larger cause, something foreign and frightening to a people who see and value the individuality of each person. Part of the terror, and therefore the effectiveness of the propaganda, is the implication of the erasure of one's sense of self. Victory of the enemy, we are given to understand, is death for all who are conquered. Even if the physical body survives, one's identity and being shall not. Pengeloth, through his choice of language, leverages a similar effect over both his in-universe audience and us as readers. Elsewhere, Pengeloth shows characters in fear of their imminent deaths, like Mim, or able to bravely face death, an act that we understand to be heroic. The deaths of orcs in their herd-like masses we understand not as heroic, but inevitable, like a drift of fading leaves in the autumn that will be gone by spring. Should the enemy win, says his message to his audience, we will be similarly subsumed. Of course, people don't see themselves this way. They don't see themselves as merely meaningless parts that exist only to serve something grander than they are. Likewise, when characters or groups are presented in this way in the Quenta Silmarillion, it is not because they see themselves as merely nameless servants of Melkor, much less that this accurately describes them. It is the narrator's bias we are seeing, and his use of death and expression of grief and mourning to exculpate the violent actions of some characters by making meaningless the deaths of their victims. Pengeloth therefore takes multiple approaches to how he writes the other, and all are guided by his experiences and biases. When he is writing about characters with whom he has connected personally, such as the dwarves, he depicts them sympathetically, showing them as capable of grief and mourning. When he cannot connect personally to a character or group, he follows the political biases of those around him, depicting Denethor of the Green Elves, for example, as a character worthy of veneration, while presenting a character like Eöl in emotionally barren terms. Finally, there are characters and groups of characters, namely the Orcs, who are entirely dehumanized when he writes their deaths. Nameless and existing only as a mass subservient to Melkor, their deaths are written in the same terms as one would write about discarding an object. In all cases, though, these are Pengeloth's perspectives and biases. Once we become aware of this perspective and its limitations, other perspectives become possible, other vistas that expand the story infinitely beyond the words Tolkien left us on the page.